cards, and I think that there are questions coming from the people who are joining us virtually as well. I wanted to, it's been talked about already, this notion of needing to build civil society and take back that information agenda. The sort of sanctuary movement is, I kind of want to delve a little bit more into that at the moment, because I think that, it's both been used in a derogatory way, as a way to sort of potentially withhold federal funding from cities who declare themselves sanctuaries. But at the same time, it has such enormous symbolism, the sanctuary movement in this country. So I wanted to kind of take it a little bit to where we are in Los Angeles at the moment, where we have the mayor who's recommitting to actually holding the line, where we have the chief of police who is committing to holding the line and saying that law enforcement officers are law enforcement officers, and that they will not stop people and question them about their immigration status, and they will not hand them over to immigration officials. How real is that? How enforceable is that? To what extent can people and groups, the civil society organizations, depend on that? At what point does federal law supersede that?
Well, just to begin, I think it's a positive movement that California's political leaders, by and large, are standing up and saying there should be sanctuary schools and there should be sanctuary cities. But you're right that the federal agents can go to homes, they can go to streets, they can go to workplaces. There's a number of friends here. We're going to team up and provide a lot of attorneys because deportations will start occurring. And so we have to have a very big force to hold that up, delay it as much as we can. But those sometimes, well, the LAPD has had a non-federal immigration enforcement rule for quite a while. So that should continue. In fact, we helped to get a law passed just this last session in Sacramento that stops immigration officials from violating the due process of immigrants in detention. And so there are a number of things that California could do. But I also believe that the stories that are going to come out, whether it's in California or any other state, are going to be very important. Because I think a lot of people who voted for this anti-immigrant movement, if I can call it that, need to see the suffering, the human suffering that's going to come from this harsh enforcement, this scapegoating that's going to come up. And I think we need to propagate those stories, because it is in that I believe that there's hope to turn people around, because I do believe that most America, obviously Hillary Clinton did get a majority of the popular vote, but I do believe that a large majority of Americans are decent people. And so they need to see the human stories and the human suffering that's going to come about in the next few years. So it's, yes, it's legal defense, strong legal defense, but we need help to tell those stories where there is that suffering and that injustice, because we need to change the minds of large numbers of Americans.
Karthick.
Just adding on what Stewart said, I mean, I think first we should not misread what this election has meant. So first of all, it's not a mandate by any stretch of the imagination. It's a very closely divided election where a few 100,000 votes across 3 states would have made a world of difference. We'd have a very different conversation. On top of that, most people voting for Trump actually are not backing all of these policies. It was an election that was decentered on issues, actually. It was so much about candidate personalities and what people thought about the trustworthiness of one candidate, another candidate just telling it as it is and shaking things up. without necessarily an endorsement of what that means to shake things up. So I think it's so important for people to actually say that they may be having buyer's remorse. Right? We're just taking it for granted that half the country who voted and had voted for a certain candidate are actually endorsing those policies. Another thing I will say is it is very heartening to see what California and jurisdictions within California are doing. There actually is evidence that deportations out of California went down pretty significantly after it passed its Trust Act. But this is where the federal government can actually respond. The Obama administration did not do that, but they could reallocate their resources and ask for more resources from Congress, who traditionally has not liked spending too much money, but that particular leadership might, to concentrate their federal resources in California. And at that point, we do need to start talking about active resistance, where it is not just non-cooperation, but to think what it means. And then finally, I'll say on sanctuary, I've just been talking to some folks recently, and I'd love to hear the legal perspective on this, was what we've come to think about in terms of churches as providing sanctuary in the 1970s and 80s, post 9/11 actually withered away, and the internal rules that were first promulgated under the Bush administration and then kind of restored a little bit under Obama essentially considers even something like a church a sensitive area for enforcement, but it does not preclude federal agents from going into those institutions. So I think even something like a church that we've thought of as a sacred space that should not have enforcement agents entering into them are vulnerable.
Alan.
A couple of things. The first thing politically, if we're in a Republican sort of rule, I feel that, local control should be the mandate. And so if cities decide that they don't want to enforce those rules, then they should enforce those rules. And being from Washington, D.C., where sometimes the humanitarian side of things really doesn't play well, I think it's also important that we talk about cost-benefit analysis, because we can't afford to deport anybody right now. The courts already have backlog to 2020 for some dates just to get in to start talking about your case. And constitutionally, or in the budget, there are only 400,000 deportations that are paid for in our budget. So where is that money really coming from to deport all these individuals? So that's a side conversation, because when you start talking about money and where the money's coming from, it changes the dynamics, which is the same thing about all prisons. Forget just immigrant prisons, but prisons across the board, which negatively impact people who are from my diaspora, the Black diaspora, whether they're African American or Black immigrants coming. We are deported and detained at a larger proportion than we represent anybody in this individual, and the same thing for Latinos across the board. On the legal argument, the way that the issue really isn't sometimes you have to change the law, because it takes, even if they were to start tomorrow in trying to change the immigration code, we see how fast an immigration bill can move through Congress. So anything that the president did as an executive order, a new president can come in on day one and sort of rescind that order, and that ends whatever programs that may be. But something that's regulatory, or something that's actual law, or something that's based in the Constitution is going to take a little bit a longer fight. And that's going to be, the 2-year window that we need to sort of mobilize and sort of change the compulsion of Congress, and maybe even get rid of the president that you might have that you didn't think you want, is also super important. But the way that they're going to reach those individuals for the sanctuary cities are sort of saying that now you are harboring and abetting immigrants in the country. And that's the real concern, that a person of goodwill and good nature could then find themselves in the crosshair of saying, you're not being an American citizen because you're helping these individuals. And that's the problem. And that has always been the problem for employers, and also the problem for private individuals such as churches. Because one of the realities that we also need to face in this country for Black farmers, or any farmers, but I specifically care about Black farmers, is that we don't have enough people actually pulling the harvest out of the field. And the way that our system is constructed is that you can't get visas in time for someone to come and pick the harvest that was ready 2 weeks ago, because the berries don't ripe on a schedule. They're ripe when they're ripe. And that's a problem. And so as those farmers have to find someone to sustain their farms, they get whatever work they can find. And they're not doing E-Verify and running through I-9s, because they need to get the cherries out of the field into the market for our for our economy. And so that's where the real structure sort of hits home. And all of those farmers are in those southern states where these individuals are from. So my main conversation is that immigration needs to become local. And it can't be a bad word anymore. Because if those southern areas start understanding what immigration means to them, the factories that they lost, also the food that's on the table, and the way that they work, and all these great restaurants they sort of see, then it sort of changes the constructs a little bit when you know the person.
Thank you. Well said. Well said.
I've heard enough.
You've heard enough. We have very, very significant brain power on this panel. Do we have some questions? I'd like to just open some. We've got some time left on our panel, and open questions from the audience, and also give folks the opportunity who are joining us virtually to. I can't see anything here. We're sort of blinded by the light. Okay. We see some notes coming down. So while we're waiting for the notes to coming down, can I have one very, very short rejoinder to that? Not a professorial rejoinder, but a short rejoinder, Paul.
Actually, I'd like to bring up a different issue, if that's all right, for just a second. Because I
But very short, because
sure,
I do,
yeah.
but I really do want to be able to
What are you
get
going to do if, in fact, the promised or proposed Muslim registry comes to be? We've had them in the past. We had one in 1942. And a bunch of my friends and their families ended up in prison for 3 or 4 years. They did the same thing in Germany, and the consequences were even more dire. What are you going to do? Well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get all my friends together, and we're all going to go down and register as Muslims and swamp the place. No, the king of Denmark did that. He went down and he put a Star of David on his chest, and it cut the ground out from under the Nazi attack on Jews in Denmark. I challenge you to do the same.